Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about all of life through the prism of food. And this week I'm with cook, gardener and beekeeper, Amy Newsome.
When I was testing this recipe, I was working in Kew's Palm House. It's quite surreal because you're working in somewhere where they're growing fresh cardamom in the soil and, because cardamom is a relative in the ginger family. So you're learning not only about the sort of like colonial history of the movement of spices and how to horticulturally grow them yourself. I was then also downstairs in the secret basement of the Palm House, which is where the staff kitchen is for us to hang out on break times, cooking up a cardamom bash cheesecake.
Her book, Honey, Recipes from a Beekeeper's Kitchen, takes us through the beekeeper's year, arguing the case for less but better honey from inside the beehive. Her holistic approach takes us from terroir to table via a garden designed for bees, as she explained when I asked her how her 3 jobs became one.
First of all, I never intended to do all 3 at exactly the same time, because obviously that might be a recipe for madness. But I think one thing led to another, which always happens for me. I go down multiple rabbit holes of getting really interested in things and just can't help myself. But I've particularly found with being able to do essentially what is 3 stages of what you might term bloom to plate, in terms of I do the active gardening, growing the plants, and then the beekeeping, looking after bees that make honey from the plants, and then moving into the kitchen, taking that honey into the kitchen. So actually for me, being involved in all stages of that process is really inspirational, and I find it really creative, because I might be in the garden working with certain plants and think, actually, I'd really like to use this in that kind of salad in the kitchen, or I just sort of make associations that I don't think I would have otherwise. So I find actually they all enrich each other, and they're all, for me, what was quite important, because I changed careers out of a sort of city office job mostly for my mental health. And what's important for me is that all 3 of them are physical in their creativity. So you have to get your hands dirty, you have to be in the moment, and that I find is really beneficial for sort of improving mood as well.
I absolutely love that. It's normally lawyers turned chefs. I mean, the amount of lawyers who turn into chefs or nutritionists because they get burnt out. Tell me, is that your story? Did you get burnt out?
Yeah, well, yes, definitely burnt out. Although I have to say, I wish I had been a lawyer that had become a cook, because I probably would have had more money behind me if I did. But no, I changed careers really early. So actually it was a really big thing. And I think people don't talk about this enough when you decide to change careers at a point where you haven't necessarily got any kind of financial backing or somebody else to help pay a mortgage whilst you make that ginormous leap. And so it was a really stressful risk, but I just knew that I had to do it. And I was working in the city, actually working for a luxury fashion brand, but it wasn't something that I'd sort of always set out to do. I kind of just landed in the position. It was actually quite corporate, and I just found, particularly in winter, I was only seeing daylight on the weekend, essentially, and actually not seeing the outdoors or the seasons change, because you're just going from standard flat to tube to office and back again. And I kind of decided that something needed to change, and I couldn't stare at a screen all day. And then I started growing fruit and veg in my back garden in London, really scrappily in tiny pots, and it just blew my mind as to how the levels of satisfaction that you can get growing something quick like lettuces that grow super fast, and then suddenly you've made your own dinner, and it doesn't matter how you felt about your day at work in the job that wasn't for you and where your mental health state was at the time. You could come back and go, I did that's amazing, and I can eat that for dinner. And it was just transformative, and that was about 7 or 8 years ago. And then I decided to really make the shift. And so I moved back in with my parents in order to even be able to do that, to retrain. And I was lucky to be able to do so. And then worked in several large gardens, including volunteering at Raymond Blanc's Le Manoir at Catsazon in Oxfordshire, and then beekeeping and gardening in the kitchen garden at Soho Farmhouse. And then I decided to retrain at Kew Gardens and really just go for it. So 4 years working full time at Kew Gardens in all the areas, the tropical palm house, absolutely everywhere.
Amazing.
And then, since then I've been doing a combination of garden design, beekeeping, and then the cooking has been a running theme throughout.
Yeah. Learning to be the bee queen. I mean, there's so many things I could say about it. Less doing, more being. Excellent. I mean, tell me about Raymond Blanc. I've interviewed him about his trees. He's so fantastically passionate about sustainability in all its forms. Take us into a moment with Raymond and his... He does bee hotels as well, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I think kind of one of the big things that I took away from having the privilege to, learn and do kitchen gardening and at Le Manoir, Raymond's hotel and restaurant, was that they are so, as you can imagine, that they are so focused on growing for flavour. So we would do, prior to the current menu that's on, we would always be prepping ahead for the next menu. So we would be flavour trialling, multiple cultivars of butternut squash or spinach, and then 5 or 6 of those would go into the kitchen. They would get cooked a variety of different ways, and then we would be there with the chefs kind of flavour testing them and scoring them out of 10 and figuring out which is the tastiest to grow for the menu the following season. And he's so passionate about that, and it's been running for so many years now that it's just the most slick operation. The kitchen will know in the morning that they need 71 bay leaves today, kind of thing. Yeah. It was absolutely amazing. Yeah, it was really wonderful to work somewhere where the quality of what you were doing was so clearly appreciated and loved, and that time spent with frozen fingers picking baby leaves early in the morning at exactly the right size, like it was all so appreciated and well respected. It was, an amazing experience.
And was that where you learnt about the importance of terroir in honeys and the different flavours? I mean, I love the way that you talk about the different flavours just through the seasons, and it makes so much sense. But, did you learn that at Le Manoir?
That actually came later, more directly through my beekeeping training and having the opportunity to work a little bit with Sarah Wyndham-Lewis, who's a honey sommelier.
Who's been on the show very recently, yeah.
Oh, amazing. And Sarah's amazing, and she is, I think the role of a honey sommelier is absolutely amazing. Brilliant. There's a great training that you can do in Italy for it. And it was really kind of around that time that I realised just the breadth of flavours in honey, but that it really deserved to be seen on that level with wine. And I'm not going to lie, when I talk about sort of honey terroir, I can't help feeling like I'm being a little bit snobby and it's a bit of a ridiculous phrase to be using, but actually it is really true, because it's exactly like wine, if not even more so than wine. Honey is the exact expression of the flavour of the landscape around the beehives, especially if it's not a blended honey. So it's just a very, very effective way of understanding the breadth of flavour that's out there and the possibilities that are out there with it. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to find sometimes. The supermarkets are getting a little bit better at stocking wider ranges of flavours, but it's still quite challenging.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about the supermarkets just to remind people about the hideousness of the honey industry. But before we do that, just paint us a picture of what happens to the bee. Why does the flavour of honeys change from season to season, in the difference between sort of summer and late autumn?
Honey itself is flower nectar that the bees have collected, and then they've converted it into honey. And it will always, if it's good honey and hasn't been overly processed and blended and microfiltered and heated and all of the things, it will taste of that landscape, because the flower nectar of every plant tastes different. It sort of has like a unique signature, its own perfume, if you like. And so bees will collect flower nectar from flowering plants growing within a sort of 1 to 3 mile radius of their hive. And that's what they're bringing back and converting into honey. So it really will taste of that area. And then bees are foraging right from sort of any time that the air temperature is about sort of 13 degrees centigrade. So that can be right through, depending on the weather that we have, from sort of early spring right up until sometimes winter, because obviously our winters are getting warmer. Yeah. So whatever's blossoming in springtime, or for instance now as we record, there's loads of bramble blossoming ready for blackberries. So bramble honey will be coming through at the moment in the honey flow. And but when you go right through into autumn, then you're going to have a completely different set of flowers flowering. And to your point, Also, the flavours will change year on year,
Yeah.
a bit like wine in the sense of those weather conditions. So if you've had, like, for instance, this spring was actually a very difficult spring for beekeepers and bees because it was long and cold. But now, actually, they're turning into having an absolutely brilliant summer because all of the flowers are going absolutely nuts after being held up so long by the spring. So whereas that might be different next year. So you get year-on-year variation in terms of what's flowering. And then also, climatically, we're having changes because of, obviously, climate change and global warming. So as our landscapes change and our climate changes, so does our honey.
I mean, for example, you say a spring English honey might be pale, gold and creamy thanks to bramble and hawthorn blossom, while in autumn it may be dark, runny and rich, reflecting plants like ivy and rosebay willow herb. I'm rather pleased about the ivy, actually. We've got loads of ivy over our flat, and the bloke upstairs wants us to get rid of it all, so I'm just going to read that out to him. Keep the ivy. Tell us about the supermarkets, though. You know, make the case why we should all be getting on our Beekeepers Association website, finding the Facebook groups, supporting our local beekeepers, and never, ever, ever buying blends of EU and non-EU honey.
Yeah, at the moment it's fortunately, until we can get better regulation on how our honey is made and how it is labelled, the brands of honeys that you'll go into the supermarket and just sort of unthinkingly pick off the shelf, the cheapest ones that don't usually say what kind of honey they are, sort of whether there's a particular blossom flavour. Unfortunately, they don't even say what country they're from. At the moment, it's really not a good idea to buy those kinds of honey. And it's really unfortunate that in our minds, sort of, we can call that honey and people associate that with honey because it's so far removed from the actual, like just any kind of good honey. So, and that's one thing that I've really learned as a beekeeper is when you do your first harvest of honey, it just blows your mind because it's a world apart from the stuff you'll buy on the shelf, which frankly has got a lot more common with golden syrup than it does with honey because it's been heated, because it's been microfiltered and overblended. And so at the moment, although we are campaigning for better regulation on labelling and provenance and also just the processing of honey, that's probably going to take a while to come in, unfortunately. And with the recent studies done, which were all over the newspapers a few weeks ago, with the EU testing honeys from all over Europe, and they tested UK honeys, unfortunately, all of the honeys tested were adulterated, which is absolutely shocking. So it is actually quite likely that those cheap jars of sort of not minimally labelled honey that you'll pick up in the supermarket might have corn syrup or sugar syrup in them. They won't be pure honey necessarily, and that's a really sad state of affairs. So in the meantime, until we can improve what you can buy on your supermarket shelves, we need to be actively voting with our wallets and doing our own research. And the best way to do that is trying to contact your local British Beekeeping Association branch, Bee Farming Association, see who's making honey in your area and just ask if you can buy some. I mean, everyone's going to be loving any extra support you can give to beekeepers because making honey is not a cheap business, it's a very difficult business, and that's another reason to be sceptical of a cheap jar of honey. It's not cheap to make unless you're making it really poorly. So you have to kind of, at the moment, do your own sort of little bit of sort of research, grocers, little corner shops selling local produce. That's where you're going to get really good honey, and you'll start to realise the sort of range of flavours that are out there, and you can start cooking with it in a way where you might be pairing different honeys with different things, or you might think, oh, a clover honey is a really great one for spreading on toast because it's got that wonderful creamy consistency, or like a borage honey is a great UK version of an acacia runny honey, and that's good for drizzling on top of yogurt and soft cheeses. Or you might go for like an oak honey or chestnut honey, a tree honey, because it's super dark and you want something really punchy to pop into a cocktail. So you can start thinking like that with it rather than sort of grabbing a jar of something sweet and not thinking. Because honestly, I would recommend buying beet sugar if you want something sweet in your kitchen that's lower price and it's, you know, a super easy, reliable form of sweetener. Whereas if you want good honey, if you want floral flavours, you want something interesting, and you actually want to sort of, there's no point buying really, really, really bad olive oil and just so that you can buy olive oil.
Yeah.
There's no point. So it's the same with honey, like buy what you can afford. I'm conscious that everyone's in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and I'm certainly not going to start advocating spending £10 on a jar of honey every week. But buy what you can afford, have a go, get interested in it, see what you think, and then go from there. And maybe try and swap from seeing honey as a ubiquitous sweetener to be used every day to a bit more of a treat, because it is honestly so difficult to make really good cheap honey that it's just really sad that we've got to that stage, unfortunately. But we can get past it, and hopefully that's what's going on right now.
Less but better, same as meat.
Yeah.
And we don't want to make an industry out of it. We don't want to encourage so much consumption that the beekeepers then have to up their intervention. Because let's talk about intervention, because there is that argument, isn't there? Leave the honey to the bees. Why should we be encouraging beekeeping to produce honey?
Well, I think certainly the intensification is a really valid point to talk about, in the sense of, like agriculture, like a lot of forms of farming, beekeeping was not immune to the intensification of agriculture movement and the industrialization that came in sort of, post-World War, when they started bringing in the inorganic fertilizers, and that ramped up production, which now obviously we know is super unsustainable. We're trying to scale it back because all of those fertilizer and chemical inputs on the land are having huge knock-on effects on our water systems, and those systems are really unsustainable without really heavy chemicals. Beekeeping, you could be argued, was quite similar in terms of breeding more bees, loads of bees, as many as possible, when actually I think with good honey it's important not to try and scale it really big, because you run into exactly the same issues of trying to meet your own demand for supply. And that's when we start overly blending from multiple apiaries all over the country, different countries, different continents, whereas actually scaling it back as small as possible and sort of seeing it as a small batch thing of when it's gone, and that was, you've captured the season and there's a limited output, is a really healthy way to look at it. Honeybees are a bred livestock. They're viewed by DEFRA as farming livestock. And honeybees have been bred for thousands and thousands of years. The earliest evidence, I think, that we have of keeping bees as opposed to wild honey hunting is ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. So it goes way back. So this is a genetic stock, if you like, that's been bred for thousands of years. So it's a little bit different to think about in terms of the rest of our wild pollinating insects. So those honeybees are already producing excessive quantities of honey because it's what they've been bred to do, and it is what they do naturally as well. So it's sort of, they are already producing an excess that you can take off as a beekeeper, and there are just either more sustainable or less sustainable ways of doing it. So more sustainable, you give them, you leave them with exactly enough honey and more, because obviously they know, you don't know exactly, you're guessing, that they're going to need, that they're going to eat through winter into the following spring, and then you take off the excess, which is considerable. It's kilos and kilos of excess. So it is completely doable in a sustainable way. And then the unsustainable way that a lot of more disreputable honey producers do, and this is where we get into, it's impossible to make good honey cheaply. This is one of the ways that you do it badly, is that you take absolutely all of the honey and then you're feeding them with sugar over winter, which is obviously like giving somebody a McDonald's for 6 months of the year. It's really not nutritional. So there's ways of doing it sustainably, but what I also will say, which is really important, and I know that Sarah Wyndham Lewis and Bermondsey Street Bees are very keenly aware of this as well, and they've moved some of their operations out of London, is that beekeeping became so popular in urban cities as a bit of a, like, well, to be honest, a bit of a hipster hobby and a bit of a sort of fun thing for businesses to have on the side as a bit of almost greenwashing, pollinator washing for the past sort of 10, 15 years. And that's led to loads of honeybees in cities, and obviously there are thousands of honeybees inside every single beehive. So that has quite an impact on local pollinator communities trying to survive, because the honeybee is only one of 250 plus species of bee in the UK, and the honeybee is the one that lives in the biggest group, so it has a really big impact on local ecosystems. And then if you're not planting enough pollinator-friendly flowers to support those bees and the wild pollinators, then you are creating a really unsustainable situation. So we've sort of come through that curve now, and now we've realised what's going on. Now we're reducing the number of hives in cities to combat this. We're planting more flowering forage, not just green walls, which are green deserts because they don't have many flowering plants on them, and being quite careful about where hives are sited. So, for example, I'm a member of the London Beekeepers Association. We were having a talk about this quite recently just to really get into the data and figure out, are there too many hives in London that we know about, or is it something else? And looking at the distribution maps, it's more at the moment a case of distribution. So there are too many hives in places that don't have enough forage, so they need to be redistributed. But luckily in places like London, actually the turnover of new beekeepers and old beekeepers is quite circular, in the sense of people are leaving London all the time, they're moving out, or they're retiring from beekeeping. So that turnover actually means that it's not increasing exponentially. But what I definitely would say is that, you know, because people say to me, oh, you're a beekeeper, you're saving the bees. And I'm not saving the bees. I'm looking after a bred species of bee and then doing all of my extra work to help support and raise the profile of all the wild pollinators that do need saving. So I think there's an education thing around understanding the different bees out there and what they need. And I certainly wouldn't recommend getting into beekeeping as a way of saving the bees or doing your bit. Get into beekeeping because you really want to make honey and do your best to learn how to create the environment for them, like planting more plants, and then use it to then learn about the rest of the pollinators.
Exactly. That's the most important thing, isn't it? You know, create bee-friendly gardens and understand about honey terroir. And eat less but better. Let's talk about some of your food moments. I mean, I have been salivating over these words: cardamom basque cheesecake with orange blossom honey. I mean, the combination of those words. Oh my Lord, tell us about this one.
So my cardamom basque cheesecake, I almost didn't put a basque cheesecake in the book because they, you know,
you wouldn't have got on this show if you hadn't.
Well, good to know. I'm so glad I did that. Well, you could argue they've been done to death, but they are everywhere. But to be fair, that is with good reason. They're absolutely delicious. And when I was, this one always reminds me of where I was when I was testing it, because when I was writing the book, I was still working at Kew Gardens. And I was a student there on the Kew Diploma in Horticulture, moving around different areas of the garden on a work placement every 3 months. And when I was testing this recipe, I was working in Kew's Palm House, the big curvy tropical glass house. And it's quite surreal because you're working in somewhere where they're growing fresh cardamom in the soil, and, you know, because cardamom is a relative in the ginger family. So all over the spices growing in the palm house. So you're learning not only about the sort of like colonial history of the movement of spices and how to horticulturally grow them yourself. I was then also downstairs in the secret basement of the Palm House, which is where the staff kitchen is for us to hang out on break times, cooking up a cardamom basque cheesecake in there. Delightfully cute. It's like it's a 1970s Starlight oven. I looked it up, and it looks like the oven out of Wallace and Gromit. The one where they go to the moon with the cheese. It looks like that oven that follows them around for a bit. And I was like, it was all like completely safe from electricity point of view. It was just a really wonderful little retro moment. But yeah, and it came out perfectly. And I thought, hang on, this recipe must be okay now. I must have nailed it. If we can cook it in a 1970s oven in the Kew Palm House basement and it still comes out fine with the sunken souffle effect. So just kind of, I just thought, God, I live a bit of a weird life here. The different
but you know, the cardamom cheesecake would have been fine on its own, but it's the orange blossom honey that just completely transforms it. And it's the same as you've done in your second food moment, which is rose roast quince with hazelnut meringue and honeyed mascarpone with apple blossom honey. You talk about meringues that you're a bit of a nerd, let's be honest, Amy. But I mean, in terms of meringues, you are obsessed, aren't you?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the right word to describe me. I'm a complete nerd. I probably, rather than going down this sort of multi-hyphenate career where I get sidetracked by multiple different things at any one moment, I probably should have been an engineer because I just love understanding how things work. And that's kind of what happens. But yeah, my meringue passion went back to very early childhood, earlier than I remember, but all of my family remembers this. We actually ended up using it as the author bio photo in my book because it's just really funny. I think I'm about 2 or 3 years old, and it's a flash photo taken in a dark dining room because I've been caught red-handed, sat on top of the dining table after Christmas dinner when all of the adults are asleep on the sofa, and I am sat on the dining table. I think I might be sat in the plate of pavlova leftovers, just eating it with my hands as this little 2-year-old. And that's definitely sort of where the pavlova obsession began. It was there from the beginning. And then, it just sort of, for me, pavlovas are your ultimate dramatic dessert. They're messy, they're slightly fiddly to make, but when you get your hang of it, they work every time, and they just come out of the oven looking absolutely ridiculous. And you get to mound them as high as you can go. Jeremy Lee style, you can go vertiginous with it. But for me, I like to do anything and everything with them. So I'm actually a really huge fire cook. It's one of my favorite ways to cook. And I love to do like a cacao kind of toasted hazelnut meringue, something with a stronger flavour on the barbecue. So I'll just, and I don't mean like fire grilling the meringue, because obviously we know they need like a low, slow cook. But you just add and this actually goes really well with the honey pairing that I've mentioned on the Rose Quince meringue recipe in my book, the apple blossom honey. Yeah. I like to use apple wood chips to just very gently smoke that chocolate hazelnut meringue, only for a few minutes. Obviously you don't want an overly smoked dessert, but it just adds an extra layer of sort of slight fruity smokiness to the cacao, which is absolutely delicious.
Fantastic. I love the way that you kind of burst the way that we normally think about honeys. Last night I cooked the beetroots in the harissa and honey combination with the raw cavolo nero, which is just fantastic, and the red peppers. Beautiful plate. And your third food moment, you do that, you garlic ferment honey with preserved lemon focaccia. Tell us about that one.
All of the recipes in the book are paired with a particular kind of honey to really pull out this idea of a honey terroir and suggest different ways that you can work with honey. But they're very much inspiration points for people to use and go off. There's a whole section of the book that describes different flavours of honey. So don't for a second feel that you need to go out and buy that exact type of honey that I've paired it with. It's just an inspirational point to kind of riff off. And I kind of was the victim of my own nerdy excitement, I guess I would say, is when I was looking at all the different things that you can do to honey, not only that you can use with honey, and fermenting honeys is a really exciting way to kind of get different flavors into it and really change the chemical makeup of the honey. But right the way through to making mead, which is the easiest ferment, water and honey. But if you pull back and do something like a garlic fermented honey, which is where, it's incredibly simple. It's not even a recipe. You just peel some cloves of garlic, lightly bash them, mix them with honey, leave it, and just leave it for as long as you want, as long as you can dare, because the honey is antimicrobial and the garlic is antibacterial and antimicrobial. So you really can leave that one for absolutely ages. And what happens is that honey is hygroscopic. So it pulls the moisture that was in the garlic clove out, and that gives it enough moisture to then start fermenting back. And then you get this, so the sugar content of the honey lowers because it's starting to ferment a little bit, but then you get that crazy garlic flavor coming out into it. But because it's starting to also ferment, it becomes a little bit funky. And then essentially you get this just insane, savory, sweet, garlicky, slightly umami, amazing garlic fermented honey. And that is just so good in so many different savory dishes. I went a bit nuts and paired with it with quite a few things in the book, which, considering it's something you've got to make rather than buy, it was a bit left field for me, but it doesn't matter. I got very excited. I think hopefully people will too. But so one of my favorite ways of using it is to make this preserved lemon focaccia, which I've done in the book. And it's super simple. The flavors are purely garlic fermented honey, preserved lemons, and rosemary. And the combination of, when you dimple the focaccia, as all the bubbles are rising, and you pop these little jellied slices of briny, salty, lemony, preserved lemon into those dimples, and then you puddle a little amount of garlic fermented honey into each of those. That little flavour puddle, as it were, is just Oh, it blew my mind. So I think everyone should cook that one immediately. I was like, oh, this is great.
It's great. I love that. So we started with the Ottolenghi flavour bombs, then Gerd Loyal starts talking about flavour chords because he's a musician, and now we've got flavour puddles. Love it. Your final food moment is the barbecue season. That's when honey really comes into its own, isn't it? It's sticky. You've put it with your double plum ribs with Tupelo honey and lime leaf slaw. Come on, tell me about barbecuing with honey.
Cooking with honey is a little bit different to cooking with other kinds of sugar because, for instance, honey caramelizes quicker than sugar. So in a baking context, that means that you have to change the timings on the bakes. You have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes you still use a good portion of sugar to the honey ratio for that flavor versus technical baking trade-off. But in things like barbecue and grilling, that quick caramelization you can really use to your advantage. And it's sort of, you can get these wonderful sort of jammy, burnt, bitter, sweet, savoury kind of notes into it that come out really easily and are really fun to do. And so for me, American style barbecue, like Deep South barbecue, is like a childhood love of mine, but not from a very well informed or particularly authentic background, purely because we had a restaurant near where I grew up in the West Midlands in Solihull, which was called Jefferson's. And I think it's now been taken over by a Harvester. But it was like an all-American style restaurant, and it used to do like baby back ribs and corn on the cobs. And we went a few times when I was quite little, and I would sort of play under the table and then sneak a hand up to steal a corn on the cob or something. And I always remember those like really tender baby back ribs. And so for me, that's a very kind of comfort food for me, being able to have those kind of ribs. And when I was recipe testing for the book, I just really wanted to do my own spin on those. And I am often quite fruit-led, as a lot of these food moments show, actually. In that I just love working with produce that's in season. I just get very excited about what's coming in and whether it's ripe or not. And so actually this was a product of me going around my local grocers, and there happened to be some plums, and then also just getting very nerdy in my special ingredients section and discovering umeboshi paste, which is the Japanese salt fermented plum paste, which is just this incredible, a little bit like the preserved lemon. You get that fruitiness, that tang, but also like a super savory, salty hit to it. And so I've combined the two of those into this amazing sauce. So that's hence it's called a double plum ribs. And then it's combined with a Tupelo honey, which is a deep South American honey, and it's made out of Tupelo tree, sweet gum, which grows in Nyssa sylvatica, I think is the Latin name. And actually it's a beautiful garden tree, and I'd really recommend it for sort of slightly wet soils. So with climate change, and we get much wetter sort of seasons, much wetter winters and springs, it's going to be a great one for us to be growing in our gardens in the UK, and it has great autumn colour as well. But anyway, so Tupelo honey is a really amazing specialist honey, and it's quite fruity and really golden. And so it's a great one to pair with this. However, again, I'm not suggesting people are going to try and track down Tupelo honey and the food miles that involves, bring that in for over the US. It's a starting point. It's an inspiration point. Use whatever you like. But here I've just made this really sticky, really tender, very comforting rib recipe. And when we shot it for the book, it was one of those recipes where you just had a little proud moment as a writer, because without asking for permission, the whole team just ate it in seconds because they just couldn't wait. So we plated it up, and then we shot me, just breaking up the ribs to illustrate how tender they are. And then just as soon as we called the shot, it just suddenly started disappearing, and everyone was just huddled in a little group around the plate. And so 30 seconds later, it was just clean bones on a plate. So we shot that as well because it looked amazing. But yeah, it was one of those moments where you're like, yes, that's a really good one.
Thanks for listening. Do pop over to Substack for extra bites of Amy and her honeybees. Just search for Gilly Smith on Substack. And I'll see you next week.